For Halloween this year, I wanted to do something on an obscure horror title, and I thought what could be better than the aptly named obscure video game. Except the game and its sequel have both had a re-release on Steam, so obviously it's more well known than I initially thought. Who knows, maybe next year. Instead I went for Capcom's 2005 horror game, Haunting Ground. This original horror title, despite being made by the same company that created the Resident Evil franchise, has fallen into obscurity. It's a spiritual successor to Clock Tower, a somewhat faded franchise itself. Now the Clock Tower series is a topic for a whole other video. All you need to know is that its style of gameplay, of running and hiding from the monster, was the driving force in the creation of this game. Now does this horror title deserve its fate of being forgotten by time, or should Capcom bring this one back from the dead? Well, let's answer that question by exploring Haunting Ground. We play as a teenager called Fiona, who after a car crash wakes up to find herself locked up in a cage surrounding a castle. She escapes in a cutscene and the game begins. You're allowed to roam around outside the small area freely, although Fiona can't do much, only wrapped up in a bedsheet. Shortly after this we run into another woman. At this point we can assume she's the castle maid. Still, we don't get many answers.
And how did I get here?
Being trapped within a creepy location is a bit of an overdone idea, even for the time. However, the mystery behind Fiona's capture, and how all the characters hints at the answers, is very well executed. The game definitely starts on the right mood. I'm critical of most video game openings, for the simple reason that they're very restrictive and cutscene heavy, until the player gets a handle on the mechanics and the context for the story. It's an understandable concession, but I wish more games had faith in the player's abilities. This game puts a lot of onus on us to work things out for ourselves, both in plot and gameplay, with minimal handholding. Now although Haunting Ground's cutscenes are deliberately slow, at least early on, they're very much a tone setter for the game. They're used to create a foreboding atmosphere. The title has a very fancy FMV to open the game, but it's not necessary to watch, as a note written by Fiona in the menu is all the context you need. And the game carries that mantra over to the gameplay as well, giving us the controls we require only when necessary. Like right here when Fiona changes her clothes. The game instructs us on some of the other actions we can perform. Fiona wrapped up in that bedsheet before, all she could do was open doors. Now we can explore more of the castle with a bigger moveset at our disposal. Still, we won't be able to perform all actions until a bit later. For now, we proceed forward. We'll come to the story at the end, but for now let's discuss the gameplay. Fiona can kick, which can be used to break these vases on the ground that contain items, and smash destructible things in the environment. It can also be used to solve minor puzzles. She's got a backstep allowing her to dodge attacks if you get the timing right. The game will introduce a character every section that chases Fiona around the area, with the goal to be obviously getting far enough away. This early part has you avoiding a big fellow called Debilitus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Here's where some of Fiona's other moves comes into play. We can kick the pursuers, but I don't think it does any damage, although I'm not certain about that. We can also kick doors open, but I often found Fiona opened the doors quite quickly when being chased, so I never really used it. Still, it's a nice feature and I'm glad it's there. She can throw or set items to either distract or damage the pursuer. A crouch will allow her to hide behind things and tracks the viewpoint of the pursuer if they're close by. We can perform a shove attack by running and kicking at the same time, though its effectiveness is questionable. There are these typewriters around, which I thought were save points initially. I guess it being made by Capcom, I couldn't help it. Here they're used to create plates to solve puzzles. The save points are actually the grandfather clocks scattered around the castle. Here we use the typewriter to solve a simple puzzle to stop a golem blocking the door ahead. Being a survival horror game, you can imagine, it's about finding key items, such as keys, or solving puzzles, allowing the player to progress further into the castle. Early on we get a cutscene showing off these blue floating orbs. These orbs make a loud noise attracting the pursuer and increases Fiona's panic if they hit her. Mercifully, they don't show up too often to really get on your nerves, and are more so an obstacle to avoid. Yeah, there is no HUD in the game, so Fiona doesn't have a traditional health bar. Instead, stamina and health are more or less the same thing. As you might have guessed, running will deplete stamina. Losing too much will result in Fiona becoming visually exhausted, making her movements more laboured. Exhaustion can be revived with certain items or just by waiting. Being attacked and losing health will cause pretty much the same stuff to happen as losing stamina. Likewise, it will also increase Fiona's panic, which is demonstrated by how fuzzy and unsaturated the screen becomes. If she gets too panicked, she'll go into a frenzy, making the screen become a blur by upping the contrast. This will cause Fiona to begin running on her own, starts making her trip and fall into stuff. Most importantly, the menu can't be opened. With no items, it's very easy to die in this state. Thankfully, it's only for a relatively short amount of time. This early section ends by being introduced to Ricardo, who claims you're the sole heir of the castle, after which Fiona passes out, from shock presumably. This has Fiona waking up in the bed from earlier, and running outside to find another integral part of the gameplay, the dog companion. Huey is a blessing and a curse. There's something to be said about having a companion in a horror game that can take that sense of isolation away. But I think an animal like a dog is a good compromise here. A dog can only do so much to keep the horrors at bay. I was enjoying the game up to now, especially the little pieces of story I was getting. But when the game brought up the dog commands, I was literally thinking this was going to be the scariest thing in the whole game, and was the reason I never heard of this game until recently. Here was another far too ambitious game that failed on its execution and was lost to time. Thankfully, giving him commands worked surprisingly well. Mercifully, they kept it to the absolute basics, with a go, follow and stay command mapped to the directions of the right analog, with the go command changing to an attack when the pursuer is about. When the pursuer is around, he works like a get out of jail free card, temporarily distracting or saving you from a grab. When you're not being chased, go will have Huey search for items in the area, or will get him to perform a manoeuvre in specific places, often nabbing us a key item. Now, while I expected commanding the dog to be much worse on paper than what's present in the game, it still has issues. The dog, while being a dog, won't always follow your commands, or outright disobey you by doing the incorrect task, and you need to praise or scold Huey for doing the wrong or right thing respectively. Needless to say, this will induce a few headaches early on. I question whether this system wasn't put in place as the dog's AI tendency to do the mistaken actions in development, so this was put in to hide some of its shortcomings, since the onus is now on the players to in a certain way program the dog correctly. Therefore, it was a clever idea to explain away the inconsistencies in the system. Oh, the dog didn't go through the hole? That's because you haven't been scolding him enough for doing the wrong thing. Oh, the dog didn't attack? That's because you haven't been praising him enough when he actually does attack. You see, I question whether there's a shady bit of design to explain away the unreliable canine AI. That's not to say the AI of the dog doesn't get better as it goes along. It does, but it's never as reliable as it should have been. Not that Huey's a burden by any means. Huey can help you solve puzzles. Case in point, we can use him to get him to sniff out the correct path ahead in the dark. And I think this is a good one, since most animals have better senses than we do, so I can see the logic here. Although, he can make for some obtuse puzzle designs, as the game stretches the actions that even a professionally trained dog can perform. For instance, later into the game, there is a hole you can get Huey to go through under a fireplace. So, I look at the map for the room he went into, and headed around to it. When I walk up to the door, I hear him barking in the room, but it looks locked or bolted shut or something. Unsure what to do, I give him a few commands, and it triggers a cutscene where he releases the wooden plank keeping the door shut. Okay, how would you know there was a wooden plank blocking the door? Look, perhaps I missed something, but even if you did know, it's a stretch to consider the dog would be smart enough to knock it off for you. Thankfully, the few times you do need the dog to solve the puzzles, I didn't run into too many issues. Still, I consider that as getting lucky. This door one in particular, I could see someone losing their mind over. Talking about losing your mind, the camera can be a pain as well. With the right analog occupied with commands for Huey, we have no control of our viewpoint, so the game employs a fairly typical fixed camera angle system, and it can be hit or miss. For this type of gameplay, it was a good choice. Now I say fixed, but the camera will often track Fiona down hallways, around corners and pan across rooms, and the good level designs mean they work quite well in tandem with each other. However, sometimes the camera isn't so great. Now this is hard to explain since I can't hand you the controller. However, since the game doesn't have tank controls, like an old school Resident Evil, where up on the analog or the directional buttons will always move you forward, regardless if the camera angle changes, giving the player a chance to reorient themselves without the character having to stop moving. Without tank controls here, can cause the player to run back and forth between camera cuts, due to the fact that the player's orientation keeps changing in relation to the camera. Now, it's hard to say whether this problem comes from a bad camera, bad controls, or a little bit of both. To the game's credit, the majority of the time the game has a wide enough angle, it never becomes an issue. Only in certain cuts does it become awkward, causing this back and forth annoyance. and easily could have been solved with an option in the menu for tank controls. To be fair to the game, this disorienting cuts often happens when you enter a doorway, as your perspective shifts to a whole new angle. Since I'm used to Resident Evil, which takes a few seconds to load into a room, it would give me a moment to catch my bearings. Here, there is no loading, and the transition between every area is flawless, something I'm not used to in this style of game. Clearly the chases would lose a lot if every moment or so there was a loading screen, so one could argue its flawless transitions between areas was outright necessary for this style of gameplay. Still, that doesn't take away from the fact that the lack of load times is highly impressive. Many people point to Clock Tower as an inspiration for this game, and yes, I don't doubt it, but Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 seems like one too. This being Capcom after all, this appears like how they wanted Nemesis to function if it wasn't for the PS1 hardware limitations at the time. You might think this optimised loading has come at the cost of its presentation, but I'm happy to say this isn't the case. The game has definitely stood the test of time. Graphics wise, even at this low resolution, looks remarkable even to this day. The game has real-time shadows and reflections, with the character models and animations being meticulously crafted, Huey being one of the most notable, as his animations are incredibly lifelike. It definitely screams high quality work from a big budget studio like Capcom. The voice acting is quite good, in that odd sort of way, where everything sounds off and people speak as if they're talking to no one, or in a Victorian horror film.
Dinner is served, miss.
Probably wouldn't work in any other genre, but in a horror game like this, it fits in quite nicely. I think that, although it pains me to say it, the old graphics and very basic animations put many people off from playing older games, even ones as recent as the PS2. Thankfully, on a technical level, this game might be one of the best looking games on the system, running and looking far better than the majority of early PS3 games. Its lack of load times after initially booting from a save means it plays to the sensibilities of a modern audience, with a scale in the environment and a level of detail that is of an incredibly high standard with a solid frame rate throughout. Now that's great and all, but how does it play? Well, the short version is, it's one of those games where you'll be unsure how to progress forward, so you'll end up running around in circles thinking about what to do next. That's what the moment to moment gameplay is like, a lot of running around back and forth for long stretches, trying to figure out how to progress, which is often trying to solve some sort of puzzle, which the pursuer often gets in the way of. We've got a map, but it's not as much help as you might think. Apart from save points, nothing is labelled on it, and unless it's a grand staircase or strangely shaped room, it's hard to differentiate the numerous small rooms from each other, so I often found it better using my own memory than looking at the map for reference. On that, to the game's credit, there's been a real effort to make each room and hallway distinct from the rest, which really helps as you need to keep 2 or 3 rooms in the back of your mind for puzzle purposes. Saying it out loud, it all sounds a bit plain and repetitive. Well, the variety is meant to come from the environments and the different pursuers throughout. I'll admit, some of the later ones do throw a spanner in the works here and there. For example, the Bilitis will leave doors open and Fiona can hide behind these for an easy escape, while the second pursuer, Daniela, will close these doors behind her, cutting off that strategy. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter who the pursuer is, or the environment you're in, as you'll end up running off for long periods of time and hiding no matter what. The pursuers are somewhat dynamic. There are scripted segments when they always appear, and then there's moments where the game gives the impression they roam around a given area. Now, unless you're being chased, or shortly after losing them, I don't believe they actually stalk the nearby region. Instead, I think there's a random chance they'll spawn in certain designated areas when you enter, and the longer you stay in that area, the more likely they are to spawn in, because after leading the pursuer to a faraway section of the castle to give myself some breathing room so I could do a puzzle, didn't work, due to them ending up being teleported back anyway, making when you're caught sometimes feel cheap. Due to what I think is the randomness of them appearing in certain areas, often in places where a few puzzles need to be done, means you might get lucky and avoid them entirely. On the other hand, the game can sometimes get into this very nasty loop of gameplay. Fiona might be in the middle of solving a puzzle, then the pursuer might enter the area, and you can tell this by the musical sting that accompanies each pursuer. So, despite the fact you might be inputting the solution, in order to avoid detection, you may kiss that goodbye until they're out of the area. But they have a huge tendency not to leave on their own. They'll roam in circles around you for ages. Mind you, the game does not allow Fiona to perform major actions while a chaser is nearby, even if they haven't seen you. So you'll start getting impatient and then you'll get spotted. After getting caught, leads you to running around in loops or going to the same old hiding spot over and over again, making for very drawn out encounters. Now, here and there I can understand this. For instance, as I've said, you use the typewriter to create plates to solve puzzles. In order to do this, the game will freeze time to allow you to type out the plate, and I think that would defeat the spirit of being chased and the lack of load times between areas if the game just suddenly allowed you to stop time in order to create a key item. Although I can say for the majority of the puzzles in the game, it was the wrong decision, by reason of the amount of endless tedium it produces. The chases lose all their impact very shortly into the game, then just become a nuisance to overcome. It's such a persistent problem that I honestly believe they should have broken up the game into safe areas where you solve puzzles and pursuer paths where you need to run and hide while you grab a key item or you just get through the area. Now the game does actually do this, however it's just one or two specific places in the game. The majority of the time the puzzles and pursuers paths overlap. Speaking of which, being a survival horror game, how could we not talk about the puzzles? Let's start with Huey. As stated earlier, you might know how to figure out a puzzle, but then again getting Huey to obey your commands can be difficult. Even when he does, he might not do the right action, bringing an annoyance factor to the whole thing. Most of the time you won't need Huey, or his part in the puzzle is very small. So, regardless of that, with the majority of them, I was never sure if I was doing the right thing. For example, here I found a picture that says the 3 spiritual substances. Close by, there was a room with 3 snake heads. Here we can insert typed plates into their mouths. So I look back in the picture and spot mercury, salt and sulfur. I turn them into plates at the typewriter and insert them into the snake's mouths. Were they meant to be inserted in a certain order? I've no idea. You also need Huey for the last one. He'll do this crazy jump that drops the plate in. And it works, but not for one moment during that puzzle I had felt I had solved anything. Another example is a part where the game has you stepping on coloured switches in a certain order, and all I did was run over them a few times by accident and solve the puzzle. Was this just pure luck or questionable design? I'm unsure myself.
Right, read it there.
He's a genius.
Jamie, that's pure chance. Like, pure just I'd sprint back and forth. I don't want to read this again.
No, because I was getting closer and closer every time. You get what I mean? I was like, oh my god, I'm figuring this out.
So we figured out another puzzle yet the wrong way again. Like,
there was one puzzle I did use a guide for. That's not for the reason you think. In the area with the third pursuer, Ricardo, you're required to refine this primer material you find in the garden into a red godstone. This will open a door blocking your way forward. You do this by using different machines that are scattered around the area. They all look the same, but they actually do different things. The order you put the material through the machines is somewhat self-explanatory by the name. The extractor, the purifier, the synthesizer and the transmuter. The biggest problem is not the unlabeled map or the maze-like design of the environment. No, it's Ricardo himself. Unlike the other pursuers, this guy is a big step up from the other two. He's lightning quick and faster than you. Not to mention, he's got a gun. His aim may be poor, but he does a ton of damage with it. But the biggest issue is, he just doesn't let up. He will chase you for what feels like hours, and he's so fast. It's hard to get far enough ahead of him to hide. Same reason Huey and items can only do so much to slow him down, before he catches back up again. And the area lacks many hiding spots to begin with. After multiple, reoccurring long chase sequences, you'll have completely forgotten where the machine was, what it did, and what part of the process of refinement you were in. Keep in mind you can't use the machines when you're being chased, so you've got to hope to lose him long enough to run where you think the right machine was, and pray he isn't there, or you'll start the whole process all over again. As I've said, this is a persistent problem with the game, but with this puzzle, it's at its maximum level of frustration. After a couple of infuriating attempts, I had enough and just used the guide. Even if the puzzles were better, it wouldn't matter, as the floor runs deeper than the puzzles themselves. The panic mechanic, with constantly needing to run away, mixed with the need to perform certain actions before you're caught again, and the maze-like map design, coalesce into a game that can become very exhaustive and frustrating to play, with the puzzles only compounding these issues. There's multiple boss fights, one for pretty much each pursuer in the game. They're worth experiencing for yourself, so I won't spoil the later ones. It's an odd choice for a game like this, with Fiona not having much of an attack, so they play out like puzzles rather than hit the weak point over and over again. Although I didn't use many items during my playthrough, I did think they came in handy during these fights. Speaking of items, there's a whole crafting item mechanic, which you can do in this safe room that pops up now and then. You match the colours to create certain items through alchemy. Alchemy is quite an important aspect to the story, so I am in favour of the player using it in concept, but to be totally honest, I never got any use out of it. I had plenty of healing items throughout the game. With the offensive items that can be fired or set against the pursuers, I found that you were better off just using Huey to slow them down, as he didn't cost resources. During the boss fights, Huey can only do so much, and I found my items had a lot more use during these. So what is this story that ties all these elements together? The plot is something I have deliberately been avoiding talking about up to now. It's got a few twists and turns along the way, and the game, rightfully so, saves its best moments for the last few sections. While the story is not groundbreaking, it's definitely out there, and I think a few more playthroughs might flesh it out even more. Overall, it will leave you with a lot of questions, but the core of it you should understand by the end, as any good story should be. This game would shine from a HD remaster in the same vein of the MGS collection, but I doubt it will ever get it. Despite games like Amnesia and Outlast having great success with an even more primitive version of Haunting Grounds gameplay, and I think that's due to some of the risque things in its plot. Now, although I'm a harsh critic in general, this is a game I actually want people to try, so I'm going to talk about its out there plot, try my best to explain why it's different from other horror media without giving too much away. The plot is very much like a grim fairy tale or dark fantasy, similar to Pan's Labyrinth, except in this case, Haunting Ground has got a real sexual overtone to the whole thing, as Fiona is often treated or objectified as a sex object. Now, while the jiggle physics on Fiona's breasts can be a bit much, and I don't think you could make her skirt any shorter, it's not without purpose, and the game uses these elements to great effect. This is Haunting Ground's own brand of horror. It's not really a game that tries to frighten you, like many modern horror games. Instead, I think it does its best to be unnerving rather than scary. This is where the voice acting and cutscenes does a great job at. The game is full of contentious themes throughout, and while I wouldn't say it's as clever or as nuanced as something similar, like Silent Hill 2, it's definitely daring with its subject matter, as I can't think of many pieces of media that would be as blatant with violence towards women as this.
I won't let him touch her.
But how does the game come off as different? Well, for example, many of the pursuers want Fiona in different ways. Unlike other horror games, the pursuers don't just want to kill you. Instead, you get a distinct sense they want to defile you in some way, making you a woman that's dressed sexually, who's practically defenseless. This puts the player in a vulnerable and uncomfortable position. Keep in mind, the game starts with Fiona all alone, with nothing but a bedsheet to cover herself. You literally couldn't make a character more exposed to predators to begin with the game definitely leaning into that. You always feel like you're being watched, especially when you're doing something personal, like changing clothes, or you're being touched when you're in a vulnerable state like being asleep. This gives the game its own brand of creep factor that's more typical behaviour of, I dare say, a stalker or a rapist, not a cheesy slasher villain. Take Debilitus, the first pursuer, who's portrayed like a giant simpleton who wants to play with Fiona like one of his dolls. That unnerving feeling that he wants to contort your body in unnatural ways like a Barbie doll. That all he sees you as is his plaything. Or how about the maid I mentioned earlier, Daniela, who's the second pursuer. She's this unnaturally perfect woman who can't experience pleasure in life. Food has no taste, and she can't have children. There are many scenes where she seems obsessed with Fiona's body. Her weakness is actually her own reflection, where she freaks out by seeing it. She chases us like she wants to use Fiona's body as her own, or rip out what makes Fiona more of a woman than her. It's just unsettling. I think this is much more creepier than if the villains just wanted to kill you. Now, that's as much as I can say without giving away spoilers. So why don't I think it'll get a remaster? Well, while I believe it's 100% unintentional, both Debilitus' name and how he's portrayed comes with some nasty connotations of people with neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism. And as always, you'll have to forgive my pronunciation. This match with the objectification of Fiona is why I don't think this will ever be remastered. Although these criticisms would be incredibly short-sighted, nevertheless, since there's no guarantee the remaster will be a success, it's a can of worms I can't see Capcom wanting to open, especially in this highly politicised climate. Don't get it twisted, Haunted Ground flips the subjectification of Fiona on its head, somewhat by the end, and justifies it in the context of the story, once the villain's motivations become clear. Now, while I don't mind spoiling old games, especially if they're incredibly well known, Haunting Ground is a game I want people to play, so I've omitted talking about the last quarter of the game, as I think it's something you should experience for yourself. Another reason I avoided talking about it is that trying to figure it out was the motive that kept me playing past the frustrating parts of the game, and I hope by saving it for you guys and girls watching this, it might do the same for you. Completing the game unlocks hard mode. Like any good horror game, it's got multiple endings, ranks you by the end, giving you a score on how you did. It being an old school Capcom game, there's tons of unlocks, collectible, Easter eggs, hidden item, costumes and bonus modes, so it's a very replayable game, which I intend to do for next Halloween. The game, with warts and all, I believe still has merits, and does enough right things in my opinion that it should have been more popular. The dog, while not perfect, it functions like a believable dog, which is an achievement that even modern games struggle to accomplish. It's funny, because this gameplay hasn't been lost to time. In fact, it's quite similar to a few modern horror titles, except nearly all of them have adopted a first-person view, and you're even more defenseless than Fiona in this. The majority of them I have no patience for, as they're often needlessly dark. The dark can be great to be atmospheric, then again after a while it just becomes irritating. Not being able to see seems scary, until you can't find what you're looking for. Haunting Ground was not a mechanically complex game by any stretch, yet most of these newer games are so bare bones in terms of actions the player can perform, they might as well be point and click games. Hell, some of them are. With gameplay as cheap as the scares they offer, I get bored of them very quickly. Haunting Ground is not perfect by any means, far from it, but I'm shocked the newer games have taken all the wrong lessons about making engaging horror games, yet an obscure horror game on the PS2 from 2005 nearly got everything right, and yet it was left by the wayside. With any luck I've convinced you, and maybe now you want to play it. Well, even that is an obstacle to overcome. See, although this game ran like a dream and I didn't experience a single glitch throughout the game, I doubt this will mean anything to people who play this after watching this video, because anyone interested probably won't be enjoying an original copy on the actual PS2. See, Haunting Ground is a rare game, and an original copy can run you over well over €100 on eBay. Not to mention, PS2 discs don't hold up well to natural wear and tear, especially the more time goes on. So, it would be a fair thing to say that you're essentially gambling your money away on whether or not you get a disc that's decent. And that's just the half of it. If you're anything like me, you don't mind, despite owning a PS5, going back to the PS2 from time to time. And anyone like me can tell you, sometimes discs won't load at all. At times, discs might work on one PS2, but not another. Games might freeze hours in at certain points, with no way to bypass it, and you'll wake up one day and realise your memory card save won't work. When I'm not doing YouTube, I like to consider myself an artist, however naive that might be. This was a digital drawing I was attempting to do of Fiona and Huey for this video thumbnail, so trust me when I tell you I don't condone stealing. But with games like Haunting Ground, there was definitely an exception. If it ever got a remaster or a PC port, I would point people that way, but as is, I feel safe in telling people just to emulate it, as I consider it Capcom's fault for not redistributing this game on a modern platform in some form. This has been a less than spooky Halloween special on Haunting Ground, and if you've made it this far into the video, I want to thank you for watching.